There are moments in history when everything changes, when the world pivots on a single decision and nothing afterward is ever the same. Sometimes these moments happen in great palaces, in the councils of kings, in the debates of philosophers and generals weighing options and calculating risks with the careful precision of men who have much to lose. Sometimes they happen in the chambers of emperors, where advisors whisper and courtiers scheme and the fate of nations hangs on the mood of a single morning. But sometimes, perhaps more often than we realize, these moments happen in simpler places. They happen on a beach at dawn, in the smoke of burning wood, in the faces of soldiers watching their only means of escape turn to ash before their eyes. They happen when a man makes a choice that cannot be unmade, when he crosses a threshold from which there is no return, when he commits himself and all who follow him to a future that holds only two possibilities: total victory or complete destruction. The ships are burning now. The flames leap from hull to hull, consuming the wooden vessels that carried an army across the narrow strait from Africa to Europe. The sails catch fire and billow upward in sheets of flame before collapsing into the inferno below. The masts crack and fall, sending showers of sparks into the morning air. Black smoke rises in columns against the foreign sky, visible for miles in every direction, a signal to friend and enemy alike that something unprecedented is happening on this shore. The soldiers stand on the beach and watch, their faces lit by the glow of the conflagration, their eyes reflecting the destruction of everything that might have taken them home. Some are silent, stunned by what they are witnessing. Others murmur prayers, calling upon God to protect them in this strange land so far from everything they have ever known. A few, perhaps, feel the stirring of anger, wondering what madness has possessed their commander, what folly has led him to destroy their only hope of escape. But all of them understand, in this moment, that their lives have changed forever. There is no going back. There is only forward, into the unknown, into whatever waits beyond the hills and rivers of a land they have never seen before this day. What does it mean to burn your ships? Not merely as a military tactic, not merely as a way to motivate soldiers who might otherwise think of retreat, but as a philosophy of life, as an approach to the challenges that face every human being who has ever lived. It means eliminating the possibility of retreat. It means making failure so catastrophic, so complete, so utterly final that the mind refuses to consider it, redirecting all the energy that might have gone into planning escape toward finding a way, any way, to succeed. Most of us live our lives with safety nets stretched beneath us, with backup plans carefully prepared, with the comforting knowledge that if things go wrong, we can always return to where we started. We keep our options open. We hedge our bets. We maintain lines of retreat even when we claim to be fully committed to the path ahead. And perhaps that is wise. Perhaps that is prudent. Perhaps that is the sensible way to navigate a world filled with uncertainty and danger. But there are those who choose differently, who understand that certain victories can only be achieved when defeat is no longer an option, when the ships have burned and the only path remaining leads forward into the unknown. The man who ordered the burning of those ships on a spring morning more than 13 centuries ago was not born to greatness. He was not the son of kings or caliphs, not raised in palaces of marble and gold, not trained from childhood in the arts of command and conquest. He began his life as a slave, a Berber from the mountains of North Africa, owned by another man, his future determined by forces utterly beyond his control. He might have lived and died in obscurity, his name forgotten before his grandchildren were born, his life leaving no mark whatsoever on the great currents of history that sweep across centuries and continents. Millions of people lived and died in exactly that way during his lifetime, their stories lost forever, their struggles and hopes and fears known only to those who loved them and then forgotten when those who loved them also passed away. This could have been his fate as well. But fate, it seems, had something else in store for him. Through a combination of ability and opportunity, of courage and circumstance, of being in the right place at the right time with the right skills and the right determination, he rose from slavery to freedom, from freedom to command, from command to conquest. And on that morning in the year 711, standing on the shores of a land that would one day bear his name, watching his fleet turn to smoke and flame, he made a choice that would change the course of history forever. His name was Tariq ibn Ziyad. He was a former slave, a Berber, a Muslim warrior who had risen through the ranks to become one of the most trusted commanders in the Islamic armies of North Africa. And this is the story of how he crossed the narrow strait between two continents, burned the ships that had carried him, and conquered a kingdom that had stood for nearly 300 years. This is the story of the man who burned his ships. But to understand how Tariq came to stand on that foreign shore, to understand why his gamble succeeded when so many others would have failed, we must first understand the world he lived in. It was a world of colliding empires and crumbling kingdoms, of ancient faiths and new revelations, of a Mediterranean balanced on the edge of transformation. The old certainties that had governed this sea for centuries were dissolving, replaced by new powers, new beliefs, new ways of organizing human society and understanding the relationship between humanity and the divine. To understand Tariq, we must understand the forces that shaped him and the opportunities that opened before him. We must understand the world of the early 8th century, when everything was changing and nothing was certain, when empires that had seemed eternal were crumbling and new powers were rising to take their place. The year is 711 AD, and the world is in motion. The old Roman order that had governed the Mediterranean for half a millennium is a distant memory in the West, a tale told by old men who remembered hearing it from their grandfathers, who had heard it from their grandfathers in turn. The Western Roman Empire had fallen more than 2 centuries before, brought down by a combination of internal weakness and external pressure that scholars still debate today. In its place, a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms had arisen, each with its own laws and customs and struggles, each trying to maintain some semblance of order in a world that often seemed to be falling apart. The Franks ruled in Gaul, the Lombards in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, and various other peoples in various other territories, all of them building something new on the ruins of what had come before. The roads that Rome had built still crossed the landscape, but they were falling into disrepair. The aqueducts that had brought water to Roman cities still stood, but many of them no longer functioned. The great monuments of Roman civilization still dotted the landscape, but they were being cannibalized for building materials, their stones carried off to construct churches and fortresses and the humble dwellings of a diminished population. In the East, the story was different. The Eastern Roman Empire still endured, ruling from its capital of Constantinople, still calling itself the Roman Empire, still clinging to the traditions and institutions of ancient Rome even as the world around it transformed. The Byzantines, as modern historians call them, controlled Greece and Anatolia, parts of Italy and North Africa, islands scattered across the Eastern Mediterranean. They preserved the learning of the ancient world in their libraries and monasteries. They maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy and a powerful military. They saw themselves as the legitimate heirs of Augustus and Constantine, the guardians of Roman civilization in a world that had largely forgotten what that civilization had meant. But even the Byzantines were under pressure, their territories shrinking, their resources strained, their attention divided among too many threats on too many frontiers. For a new force had arisen in the East, one that had transformed the world with a speed and completeness that no one could have predicted. Less than a century had passed since the Prophet Muhammad had received his first revelations in a cave near Mecca, since he had begun to preach the message of Islam to the people of Arabia. In that brief span of time, less than 100 years, his followers had created one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. They had swept out of the Arabian Peninsula with a force that seemed almost supernatural, defeating armies far larger than their own, conquering territories that had been held by great powers for centuries. They had defeated the Persian Empire, the ancient rival of Rome, the great power that had dominated the East for more than 1,000 years. The Sassanid dynasty, which had ruled Persia since the 3rd century, was gone, its territories absorbed into the new Islamic Caliphate, its Zoroastrian religion giving way to the faith of the Prophet. They had taken Egypt from the Byzantines and Syria and much of Anatolia. They had pushed east to the borders of India and beyond, carrying the message of Islam to peoples who had never heard of Arabia or its prophet. And they had pushed west, across the whole of North Africa, from the Nile to the Atlantic, from Egypt to Morocco, transforming the religious and cultural landscape of regions that had been Christian for centuries. The speed of this expansion astonished contemporary observers and has puzzled historians ever since. How had a small community of believers in the Arabian desert become, in the span of a single lifetime, the masters of half the known world? The answers are complex and debated, but several factors seem clear. The Byzantine and Persian empires had exhausted themselves in decades of warfare against each other, their populations drained by taxation and conscription, their armies weakened by constant fighting. The message of Islam offered a compelling alternative to the complex theological disputes that divided Christians, disputes about the nature of Christ that had led to persecutions and schisms and bitter resentments. The Arab warriors who carried this message were motivated by faith, by the promise of paradise for those who died in the cause of God, and by the more earthly rewards of plunder and conquest. And the peoples they conquered often found that life under Muslim rule was no worse, and sometimes better, than life under their previous masters. The jizya tax that non-Muslims paid was often less burdensome than the taxes they had paid before. The relative tolerance that Islamic law extended to Christians and Jews allowed communities to maintain their faith and their customs under the new regime. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate, ruling from its magnificent capital in Damascus, had reached its greatest extent. The Caliph in Damascus was the commander of the faithful, the successor of the Prophet, the ruler of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of China. His governors administered provinces spanning 3 continents. His armies were the most successful military force the world had seen since the legions of Rome at their height. And those armies were still expanding, still pushing outward, still seeking new territories to bring under the banner of Islam. The momentum of conquest had not yet exhausted itself. The warriors who had conquered Persia and Egypt and North Africa were looking for new lands to subdue, new peoples to bring into the community of the faithful, new wealth to fill the treasuries of Damascus. And at the western edge of the Caliphate, where North Africa reached its closest point to Europe, opportunity beckoned from across a narrow strait of water. The Arab armies had reached North Africa in the middle of the 7th century, pushing west along the Mediterranean coast, following the routes that Roman legions and Carthaginian merchants had traveled centuries before. But the conquest of North Africa was not like the conquests of Persia or Egypt. It was slower, harder, bloodier. The peoples who lived in these lands, the Berbers, were unlike any the Arabs had faced before. They were not citizens of a centralized empire, accustomed to obeying whoever held the capital. They were tribal peoples, fiercely independent, living in mountains and deserts that they knew as no invader could ever know them. They had resisted the Romans for centuries, never fully submitting to imperial rule. They had resisted the Vandals after them, and the Byzantines after that. And they resisted the Arabs as well, fighting a guerrilla war that lasted for decades, rising up again and again even after they had been defeated, refusing to accept subjugation by yet another foreign power. The conquest of North Africa took more than 50 years, from the first Arab raids in the 640s to the final subjugation of the Berber tribes in the early 700s. It was accomplished not merely by military force, though there was plenty of that, but also by religious persuasion. The message of Islam appealed to many Berbers, perhaps because it offered them something that previous conquerors had not. Under Roman and Byzantine rule, the Berbers had been second-class subjects, excluded from the centers of power, looked down upon by the urban elites of the coastal cities. But Islam, at least in theory, made no distinction between Arab and Berber. A Berber who converted to Islam was the equal of any Arab in the eyes of God. He could rise through the ranks of the military, could hold positions of authority, could participate fully in the life of the community of believers. This was a powerful message for a people who had been marginalized for centuries. Many Berbers embraced Islam with the fervor of new converts, becoming not merely subjects of the caliphate but its champions, carrying the faith forward with a zeal that sometimes exceeded that of the Arabs themselves. At the western edge of the caliphate, where North Africa reached its closest point to Europe, lay a narrow strait of water that the ancients had called the Pillars of Hercules. At its narrowest point, only 8 miles of water separated the African shore from the European. On clear days, the mountains of one continent were visible from the shores of the other, so close that a strong swimmer might almost imagine crossing without a boat. For the Arab and Berber soldiers who had reached these shores, who had conquered everything from Egypt to the Atlantic, that distant land was a mystery and a temptation. They knew that a Christian kingdom ruled there, one of the successor states to the Roman Empire, wealthy and ancient, its cities filled with treasures accumulated over centuries. They had heard rumors that this kingdom was riven by internal conflicts, that its nobles were more interested in fighting each other than in defending against foreign enemies, that its king sat uneasily on a disputed throne. They saw opportunity on the far shore, and they began to wonder what might be achieved if an army were to cross those waters. The man who governed North Africa for the Umayyad Caliphate was named Musa ibn Nusayr, and he was listening carefully to these rumors. Musa was an experienced administrator and military commander, a man who had spent decades in the service of the Caliphate, rising through the ranks to become one of the most powerful officials in the western provinces. He had completed the conquest of North Africa, subduing the last of the Berber resistance, establishing Muslim rule from Egypt to the Atlantic. Now he governed this vast territory from his base in Africa, modern Tunisia, managing the complex business of integrating newly conquered peoples into the caliphate. But Musa was ambitious, and he saw in the land across the strait an opportunity for further conquests, further glory, further advancement in the service of the caliph. The question was how to seize that opportunity, and who to send to test whether the rumors of Visigothic weakness were true. The kingdom that lay beyond the strait was called the Visigothic Kingdom, and it had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 300 years. To understand why Tariq's invasion would succeed so spectacularly, to understand why a kingdom that had endured for centuries would collapse in a matter of months, we must first understand what that kingdom was and how it had come to be. The Visigoths were a Germanic people, part of the great wave of migrations that had swept across the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, transforming the political landscape of Europe forever. They had wandered for generations, fighting and negotiating, seeking a place to settle, before finally establishing themselves in the Iberian Peninsula and making it their home. Their story is one of transformation and adaptation, of a barbarian people gradually taking on the trappings of Roman civilization while never quite losing their distinct identity. But by the early 8th century, that story was coming to an end, though the Visigoths themselves did not yet know it. The Visigoths had first entered the Roman Empire in the 4th century, fleeing from the Huns who were sweeping across the steppes from Central Asia. The Romans had allowed them to settle within the empire's borders, hoping to use them as soldiers against other threats. But the relationship between the Visigoths and the Romans quickly soured. Mistreated by corrupt Roman officials, denied the supplies they had been promised, the Visigoths rose in revolt. In 378, at the Battle of Adrianople, they destroyed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens himself, one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. For the next 30 years, the Visigoths wandered through the empire, sometimes fighting against Rome, sometimes fighting for it, never quite finding a permanent home. In 410, under their king Alaric, they did the unthinkable. They sacked Rome itself, the eternal city that had not been captured by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The psychological impact of this event on the Roman world was immense. It seemed to signal that the old order was truly ending, that the gods who had protected Rome for so long had finally abandoned her. After the sack of Rome, the Visigoths continued their wanderings, eventually settling in southern Gaul and then, over the course of the 5th century, expanding into the Iberian Peninsula. By the late 5th century, they had established a kingdom that stretched from the Loire River in France to the Strait of Gibraltar in the south. But their control of Gaul was not to last. In 507, the Frankish king Clovis defeated the Visigoths at the Battle of Vouille, killing their king Alaric II and driving them out of most of their Gallic territories. After this disaster, the Visigoths concentrated their power in Iberia, making Toledo their capital and gradually consolidating their control over the entire peninsula. For the next 2 centuries, they would rule this land, creating a kingdom that blended Germanic traditions with the legacy of Rome, that built churches and codified laws and maintained some semblance of order in a world that often seemed to be falling apart. The Visigoths who ruled Iberia were a small minority in a land of Hispano-Romans, the descendants of the people who had lived under Roman rule for centuries. The Gothic aristocracy formed perhaps 5% of the total population, maybe less, ruling over millions of people who spoke Latin, followed Roman laws, and maintained Roman customs in their daily lives. This was a situation that required careful management. The Goths had to maintain their distinct identity as a ruling class while also accommodating themselves to the civilization they had conquered. Over time, they adopted Latin as their language, converted from Arian Christianity to the Catholic faith of their subjects, and took on many of the cultural practices of the Roman world. By the 7th century, the distinction between Goth and Roman had blurred considerably, though it had not disappeared entirely. The aristocracy was still predominantly Gothic, still proud of their Germanic heritage, still clinging to traditions that set them apart from the people they ruled. But beneath the surface of this apparently stable kingdom, serious problems were festering. The Visigothic monarchy was elective rather than hereditary, which meant that every succession was a potential crisis. When a king died, the great nobles would gather to choose his successor, and this choice was often contested. Powerful families put forward their own candidates, formed alliances and broke them, resorted to bribery and intimidation and sometimes outright violence. Kings were made and unmade by factions within the nobility, and many reigns ended in assassination or civil war. This system ensured that no single family could establish a lasting dynasty, but it also meant that the kingdom was periodically convulsed by struggles for power that weakened its ability to respond to external threats. A kingdom that was constantly fighting itself could not effectively fight anyone else. The nobility itself was a problem. Over the centuries, the great families had accumulated vast estates and private armies, making them nearly independent powers within the kingdom. They owed nominal loyalty to whoever sat on the throne in Toledo, but their real allegiance was to their own interests and those of their kin. A weak king might find himself unable to command the obedience of nobles who had more soldiers and more wealth than the crown itself. A strong king might succeed in bringing the nobility to heel, but the next succession crisis would undo all his work, as the nobles reasserted their independence and fought over who would wear the crown next. The Visigothic kingdom was less a unified state than a collection of powerful families held together by tradition and the lack of any alternative. When a serious challenge arose, this fragmented structure would prove unable to mount an effective defense. The common people of the kingdom, the Hispano-Roman majority who worked the fields and tended the flocks and labored in the workshops, had little stake in the survival of their Gothic overlords. They paid their taxes and obeyed whatever laws were imposed upon them, but they felt no particular loyalty to a ruling class that remained, even after 3 centuries, distinctly foreign. The Gothic nobles spoke Latin now, worshipped in Catholic churches, lived in Roman-style villas, but they were still the conquerors, still the masters, still the people who took without giving back. If a new set of masters were to appear, promising lighter taxes and less interference in daily life, the common people would have little reason to resist. They might even welcome the change, hoping that new rulers would treat them better than the old ones had. And then there were the Jews. The Jewish community of Iberia was ancient and substantial, with roots going back to Roman times or perhaps even earlier. For much of the Visigothic period, they had lived in relative peace, practicing their faith, engaging in commerce, contributing to the cultural and economic life of the peninsula. But in the later years of the Visigothic kingdom, royal policy toward Jews had grown increasingly harsh. Beginning in the early 7th century, successive kings had enacted laws designed to pressure Jews into converting to Christianity. Jews were forbidden from holding public office, from owning Christian slaves, from practicing their religion openly. Those who converted were subjected to special surveillance, suspected of secretly maintaining their old faith. Children were taken from Jewish families and raised as Christians. By the early 8th century, the Jewish community had been subjected to decades of persecution, and many of its members had every reason to welcome any change in the established order. In the year 710, King Witiza died, and the kingdom plunged into its final crisis. Witiza had been a controversial figure, accused by later chroniclers of various crimes and immoralities, though how much of this was true and how much was the propaganda of his successors is difficult to say. What is certain is that his death left the succession uncertain. Witiza had sons, and they expected to inherit their father's throne, or at least to have a say in who would occupy it. But they were not the only candidates. A powerful nobleman named Roderick, the Duke of Baetica, also had designs on the crown. And Roderick had the stronger army. The details of what happened next are obscured by the biases of the sources, most of which were written long after the events and shaped by the agenda of the writers. What seems clear is that Roderick moved quickly to seize power, crowning himself king in Toledo before the sons of Witiza could organize effective opposition. The sons of Witiza were pushed aside, their claims ignored, their supporters marginalized or eliminated. They were not killed, which would prove to be a significant oversight, but they were stripped of power and influence, left to nurse their grievances while Roderick consolidated his hold on the throne. This might have been the end of the matter, another succession crisis resolved by force, another king establishing himself through the strength of his sword arm. But the sons of Witiza were not willing to accept their defeat. They began to look for allies who might help them reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Across the strait, in North Africa, the governor Musa ibn Nusayr was interested in what he was hearing about the Visigothic kingdom. The rumors of internal conflict, of a disputed succession, of a nobility divided against itself, all of this suggested opportunity. But Musa was a cautious man, and he knew better than to commit to a major invasion based on rumors alone. He needed more information, more reliable intelligence about the true state of affairs in the peninsula. And then, as if sent by Providence, informants began to arrive at his court, offering exactly the information he needed. The most important of these informants was a man named Julian, who held the title of Count and governed the city of Ceuta on the African shore of the strait. Julian was nominally a subject of the Visigothic kingdom, but his city was isolated from the rest of the kingdom by the sea, and his loyalty to the Gothic crown was questionable at best. The later legends would supply a dramatic motive for Julian's betrayal. They would say that his daughter had been sent to the court of Toledo for her education, as was customary for the daughters of nobles, and that King Roderick had violated her honor, seducing or perhaps raping her. Julian, in this version, was a father seeking revenge for his daughter's shame. The truth is probably more prosaic. Julian may have been aligned with the sons of Witiza, may have had political or economic grievances against Roderick, may simply have seen which way the wind was blowing and decided to ally himself with the rising power of Islam. Whatever his motives, he offered Musa invaluable assistance, ships to carry soldiers across the strait, information about the defenses and weaknesses of the Visigothic kingdom, and the promise that many within the kingdom would welcome the invaders as liberators. The sons of Witiza themselves may also have made contact with Musa, offering their support for an invasion that would overthrow the man who had stolen their inheritance. The sources are unclear on the exact nature of their involvement, but what is certain is that when Tariq's invasion came, forces aligned with the sons of Witiza would play a crucial role in its success. The Visigothic kingdom would be destroyed not only by external attack but by internal betrayal, by nobles who preferred to see their kingdom fall than to accept the rule of a man they considered a usurper. Musa listened to what Julian and the others told him, and he began to form a plan. But he was still cautious, still unwilling to commit the full resources of his province to an invasion that might fail. He decided to begin with a reconnaissance, a small expedition that would test the defenses of the Visigothic coast and determine whether the promises of easy conquest were genuine or mere fantasy. In the year 710, he sent a force of approximately 500 men across the strait under the command of a man named Tariq. This small army landed on the Iberian coast, raided the nearby settlements, and returned to Africa with plunder and prisoners and, most importantly, information. The raid was a success. The defenses were indeed weak. The local population had offered little resistance. The promises of easy conquest seemed to be true. Now Musa was ready to proceed with a larger expedition. But he did not intend to lead this invasion himself, not yet. For this initial venture, this full-scale test of the Visigothic defenses, he would send a subordinate, a man he trusted to lead an army into the unknown and make decisions without constant supervision. This man would need to be capable and brave, experienced in warfare and skilled in leadership. He would need to be loyal to Musa, someone who would not use a successful conquest to build an independent power base. And he would need to command the respect of the Berber soldiers who would make up the bulk of the invasion force. Musa knew exactly who to send. His name was Tariq ibn Ziyad. We do not know exactly when Tariq ibn Ziyad was born, or precisely where in the vast stretches of North Africa he first drew breath. The sources are fragmentary and contradictory, written long after the events they describe by authors who had their own agendas and their own uncertainties. What we can piece together is an outline, a shadow of a life that would have remained utterly obscure if not for the extraordinary events that brought it into the light of history. He was a Berber, born into one of the many tribes that inhabited the mountains and deserts of the Maghreb. His people had lived in these lands since time immemorial, since before the Romans came, since before the Carthaginians built their trading posts along the coast. They spoke languages unrelated to Arabic or Latin, languages that are still spoken in parts of North Africa today. They had their own customs and traditions, their own ways of organizing society and understanding the world. They were fiercely independent, resistant to outside rule, proud of their heritage even as the great empires of the Mediterranean lapped at the shores of their homeland. The specific tribe or region from which Tariq came is a matter of dispute among the sources. Some say he was from the Nafsa tribe, others from different Berber groups. Some place his origins in what is now Morocco, others in Algeria or Libya. These disagreements reflect the limited information available to later writers, who were trying to reconstruct the background of a man who had become famous but about whose early life little was remembered. What all the sources agree on is that he was a Berber, that he converted to Islam, and that at some point in his life he was enslaved. This last detail is particularly significant. Tariq began his life as a slave, the property of another man, his future determined by forces entirely beyond his control. In most circumstances, this would have meant a life of labor and obscurity, a life that left no mark on history. But slavery in the Islamic world was not always a permanent condition, and the man who owned Tariq seems to have recognized something exceptional in his slave. The name Tariq ibn Ziyad itself tells us something about his story. Tariq is an Arabic name, not a Berber one. Ibn Ziyad means son of Ziyad, and Ziyad is also an Arabic name. This suggests that Tariq took an Arabic name when he converted to Islam, as was common among converts, and that his identification as son of Ziyad may indicate his connection to the Islamic faith rather than his literal parentage. Some sources suggest that Ziyad was the name of his former master, and that Tariq took this name as his patronymic upon his manumission, as was customary for freedmen. Others suggest that Tariq's father had already converted to Islam and taken the name Ziyad. The ambiguity is typical of what we know about Tariq's early life. Fragments and guesses, traditions and speculations, pieced together by later writers who were as uncertain as we are today. What does seem clear is that Tariq was at some point the slave of Musa ibn Nusair, the governor of Ifriqiya, or perhaps of another Arab commander closely connected to Musa. Slavery in the Islamic world was a complex institution, different in important ways from the chattel slavery of the Americas that shapes most modern understandings of the term. Islamic law recognized slaves as human beings with certain rights, not merely as property to be used and discarded. Slaves could marry, could own property with their master's permission, could testify in court under certain circumstances. Most importantly, Islamic law encouraged the manumission of slaves as a pious act and provided several pathways by which a slave could obtain freedom. A slave who converted to Islam and served his master faithfully could expect to be freed, and upon manumission would become a client of his former master, connected to him by bonds of loyalty and obligation that would persist for the rest of their lives. This is what happened to Tariq. He converted to Islam, embracing the faith with what seems to have been genuine conviction. He served his master faithfully, demonstrating ability and loyalty that earned him trust and responsibility. And eventually he was freed, becoming a mawla, a client or freedman of Musa ibn Nusayr. But even as a freedman, he was not entirely independent. The relationship between patron and client was one of the foundations of Islamic society in this period, and a freedman was expected to remain loyal to his former master, to serve him when called upon, to advance his interests as if they were his own. In return, the patron was expected to protect and promote his client, to provide him with opportunities to advance, to treat him almost as a member of the family. This relationship between Musa and Tariq would prove crucial in the events that followed. Tariq proved to be an exceptional soldier and an even more exceptional leader of men. In the continuing campaigns to consolidate Muslim control over North Africa, he distinguished himself repeatedly, earning the trust of his superiors and the devotion of his fellow Berbers. He understood warfare, not merely the tactics of individual battles but the strategy of larger campaigns, the logistics of moving armies across difficult terrain, the psychology of motivating men to fight and die for a cause. He understood politics as well, the complex dynamics of tribal alliances and personal loyalties that governed Berber society, the need to balance competing interests and maintain unity among diverse groups. And he understood religion, the power of faith to inspire men to great deeds, the way that a shared belief in God and the Prophet could bind together people who had little else in common. By the early 8th century, Tariq had risen to become the governor of Tangier, the fortress city that guarded the western approach to the strait. This was a position of considerable responsibility and trust, given to a man who had begun his life as a slave but who had proven himself worthy of command. From Tangier, Tariq could look across the narrow strait and see the mountains of Europe rising from the sea. He could see the land that would one day bear his name, the land that he would conquer with fire and sword, and the unshakable conviction that God was on his side. When Musa ibn Nusayr began to plan his invasion of the Visigothic kingdom, Tariq was the obvious choice to lead the expedition. He knew his men, spoke their language, shared their background, and had earned their respect through years of service. He was loyal to Musa, bound to him by the ties of clientage that were central to Islamic society. And he had demonstrated, again and again, that he was capable of independent command, of making decisions without waiting for orders, of seizing opportunities as they arose. In the spring of 711, the invasion force assembled at the coast. The army that Musa had raised for this expedition numbered approximately 7,000 men, most of them Berbers like Tariq himself, with a smaller number of Arabs in positions of command. It was not a large army by the standards of the great Islamic conquests. The armies that had conquered Persia and Egypt had been larger, but it was a formidable force nonetheless, composed of veteran soldiers who had proven themselves in the long struggle to conquer North Africa, men who believed that they were fighting in the cause of God and that victory or martyrdom awaited them on the other side of the water. They gathered at the coast, boarded the ships that Count Julian had provided, and set sail across the narrow strait toward a destiny that none of them could have imagined. The crossing itself was relatively uneventful, though it must have been a moment of profound significance for the men who made it. Most of them had never been to sea before, had never ventured beyond the lands they had known since childhood. Now they were sailing toward an unknown shore, leaving behind everything familiar, committing themselves to a venture from which there might be no return. The strait was narrow enough that the crossing took only a few hours, but those hours must have felt like an eternity to men who had never experienced the motion of a ship, who watched the African shore recede behind them and the European shore grow closer ahead. They landed at the foot of a massive rock that rose from the sea, a natural fortress that would become their first stronghold in the new land. The soldiers called it Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq, and that name, worn down by centuries of Spanish and English and international usage, would eventually become Gibraltar. It is perhaps the most enduring monument to Tariq's achievement, a geographical feature named after a former slave who led an army onto its shores more than 1,300 years ago. In the first days after the landing, Tariq consolidated his position around the Great Rock, establishing a base camp, posting sentries, sending out scouts to learn the lay of the land. The local population, a mixture of Hispano-Romans and others who had little love for their Visigothic overlords, offered limited resistance. Some fled at the approach of the invaders, abandoning their homes and their fields to seek safety in the interior. Others remained, watching warily to see what these newcomers from across the sea would do. A few, perhaps, saw opportunity in the arrival of these foreign soldiers, a chance to settle old scores or improve their position under new masters. The invasion had begun, but its outcome was still uncertain. Everything depended on what happened next, on how the Visigoths would respond and how Tariq would meet that response. Word of the landing reached King Roderick in the north, where he was engaged in a campaign against the Basques, those fiercely independent mountain people who had never fully submitted to Visigothic rule. The news must have been unwelcome. Roderick had been on the throne for less than a year, his position still not fully secure, his rivals still plotting against him. Now he faced an invasion from the south, a threat that required him to abandon his current campaign and march his army across the length of the peninsula to meet it. He sent orders for the nobles of the kingdom to gather their forces and join him, summoning all the military strength of the Visigoths to crush this incursion before it could take root. The response was impressive in numbers. Nobles from across the kingdom answered the call, bringing their retinues and their armed followers, their banners and their standards. By the time Roderick marched south, he commanded an army that may have numbered as many as 30,000 men, perhaps even more. It was far larger than the force that Tariq had brought across the strait. By any conventional calculation, the Visigoths should have won the coming battle easily. But Tariq was not idle while Roderick gathered his forces. He knew that he had a limited window of opportunity, a brief span of time before the full might of the Visigothic kingdom descended upon him. He used that time to strengthen his position, to gather intelligence, to probe the defenses of the surrounding region. He moved his army away from the coast, advancing inland to meet any Visigothic forces that might approach. And he received reinforcements. Musa, hearing of the successful landing, sent additional troops across the strait, perhaps 5,000 more soldiers, bringing Tariq's force to approximately 12,000 men. It was still smaller than the army Roderick was assembling, but it was larger than the original invasion force, and the new arrivals brought fresh energy and supplies. And then, according to the traditional accounts, Tariq made the decision that would define his place in history. The ships that had carried the army across the strait were still anchored in the harbor below the Great Rock. They represented safety, escape, the possibility of retreat if the invasion went badly. As long as those ships remained, Tariq's soldiers knew that they had a way out, that they could flee back across the water to Africa if the Visigoths proved too strong. This knowledge was both a comfort and a danger. A soldier who is thinking about escape is not a soldier who will fight with everything he has. A soldier who knows that retreat is impossible, that there is no way out except through victory, will find reserves of courage and determination that he never knew he possessed. Tariq understood this truth about human nature, understood it perhaps better than any commander of his age. And he acted on that understanding. The order went out, burn the ships. The flames began to rise from the harbor, orange and red against the blue of the sea and the sky. The soldiers watched as their means of escape were consumed by fire, as the hulls cracked and collapsed, as the masts toppled into the inferno. Black smoke billowed upward, visible for miles in every direction, a signal that could not be misunderstood. Some of the soldiers must have felt fear, perhaps even anger, watching their only way home destroyed before their eyes. Others may have felt a strange exhilaration, a liberation from the burden of choice. They could not retreat now. They could not flee. The only path remaining led forward, into the heart of the enemy's territory, toward whatever fate awaited them there. The decision had been made for them, and now they had only to live with its consequences. Whether Tariq actually burned all the ships, or only some of them, or whether the burning happened exactly as the legends describe, we cannot know for certain. Some historians have questioned the story, pointing out that destroying the entire fleet would have cut off supplies and reinforcements from Africa, a strategically foolish move for an army operating in hostile territory. Perhaps the ships were simply sent back to Africa to ferry more troops, and the legend of burning grew up later to dramatize the commitment of the invaders. Perhaps only some ships were burned, enough to make the point without completely eliminating the possibility of retreat. Perhaps the burning was more symbolic than practical, a gesture rather than a wholesale destruction. What matters, in the end, is not so much what actually happened as what the soldiers believed had happened. They believed that retreat was impossible. They believed that their commander had staked everything on victory. And that belief shaped their behavior in the days and weeks that followed. The words attributed to Tariq after the burning of the ships have been preserved by later Arab historians, and they have echoed through the centuries as one of the great speeches in military history. We cannot know whether Tariq actually spoke these words, or anything like them. The speech may have been invented by later writers, putting into Tariq's mouth the sentiments they believed he must have expressed on such an occasion. But whether the words are authentic or legendary, they capture something essential about the moment and the man. O people, Tariq is said to have declared, "Where is the escape? The sea is behind you, and the enemy before you. You have nothing, by God, except only your courage and your patience. Know that you are in this land like orphans at a banquet of the stingy. Your enemy faces you with troops whom he provisions with every kind of supply, and you have no sustenance other than what you take from your enemy. If the days pass by and you delay to engage him, your power will fail you, and your enemy will gain strength against you. Attack him therefore before he can provision his armies and grow strong. Be patient, for patience is the key to relief and victory. God has delivered this land into your hands, and if you are steadfast, the reward will be great in this world and the next." The speech, whether authentic or not, touches on themes that would have resonated deeply with the soldiers who heard it, or with the later audiences for whom it was written down. It acknowledges the desperate nature of their situation, stranded in a foreign land with no way home. It appeals to their religious faith, presenting the invasion as a holy war, a jihad in which death in battle would bring eternal reward. It emphasizes the practical necessity of quick action, the danger of allowing the enemy time to gather strength. And it promises rewards, both spiritual and material, for those who persevere. These are the themes that motivated armies throughout the Islamic conquests, and they would motivate Tariq's soldiers as they marched to meet the Visigoths. The burning of the ships is more than a military tactic. It is a statement about human psychology, about the relationship between commitment and achievement, about the way that the mind responds to situations where retreat is no longer an option. When escape is possible, some part of the mind is always calculating the odds, weighing the costs of continuing against the safety of withdrawal. This is not cowardice. It is simply the way the human mind works, constantly evaluating options, seeking the path of least resistance, trying to maximize survival while minimizing risk. But when escape is impossible, when the ships have burned and the only path leads forward, that calculation ends. All the mental energy that would have gone into evaluating escape routes is redirected toward finding a way to succeed. The desperate mind becomes creative, resourceful, capable of efforts that would have seemed impossible when safety was still an option. This is why, throughout history, commanders have sometimes destroyed their own lines of retreat. Cortés would famously sink his ships in Mexico 8 centuries later, citing Tariq's example. Napoleon would burn bridges behind his armies. Leaders in countless situations have understood that sometimes the only way to ensure total commitment is to make retreat impossible. The army that marched inland from the shores of Gibraltar was transformed by what had happened on the beach. These were no longer soldiers who might retreat if things went badly. These were men who had to win or die, who had nothing to look forward to except victory or martyrdom. They were also, in their own understanding, warriors of God, engaged in a sacred struggle to bring new lands under the banner of Islam. The burning of the ships could be seen as an act of faith, a trust in divine providence rather than in wooden hulls. God would provide victory, or God would grant them paradise. Either way, they had nothing to fear. This combination of desperation and faith made them formidable opponents, men who would fight with a ferocity that the Visigoths had never encountered before. The two armies met in mid-July of 711, in a battle that would decide the fate of a kingdom. The exact location of the battle has been debated by historians, but it is traditionally placed near the mouth of the Guadalete River, in what is now the province of Cádiz. Some sources place it elsewhere, near a lake called La Janda or in other locations in the southern part of the peninsula. The uncertainty reflects the fragmentary nature of our sources, written long after the events by authors who were not always certain of the geographical details. What is not in doubt is the outcome. The battle was a catastrophe for the Visigoths, a defeat so complete that it destroyed not just an army but an entire kingdom. King Roderick had assembled a formidable force, far larger than the army Tariq commanded. The nobles of the kingdom had answered his summons, bringing their retinues and their followers, their cavalry and their infantry. The Visigothic army may have numbered 30,000 men or more, veterans of campaigns against the Basques and the Byzantines, equipped with the weapons and armor that the Gothic aristocracy had accumulated over centuries. By any conventional measure, they should have crushed the invaders. They outnumbered Tariq's forces by perhaps 2 or 3 to 1. They were fighting on their own territory, with supply lines and local knowledge that the invaders lacked. They had every advantage except one. They were not united. The battle began, and for a time it seemed that the Visigoths might prevail. The fighting was fierce, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Tariq's soldiers fought with the desperation of men who had no retreat, but the Visigoths fought with the fury of men defending their homeland. The issue hung in the balance for hours, perhaps for days, as the two armies clashed and separated and clashed again. And then, at a crucial moment, the trap was sprung. The sons of Witiza, the former king, had not forgotten their grievance against Roderick. They had joined the royal army, bringing their followers with them, appearing to be loyal subjects rallying to the defense of the kingdom. But their loyalty was a mask, a deception waiting for the right moment to be revealed. At some point during the battle, when the fighting was at its fiercest and the outcome still uncertain, the followers of the sons of Witiza broke from the Visigothic lines. Some sources say they simply fled the field, abandoning their comrades to their fate. Others suggest that they actually turned on their own side, attacking the loyalists from within, adding to the chaos and confusion. Whatever the exact nature of their betrayal, its effect was decisive. The Visigothic army, already struggling against Tariq's ferocious assault, now found itself attacked from within by men it had counted as allies. The lines collapsed. The cohesion that holds an army together in battle dissolved into panic and flight. The Visigoths broke and ran, and Tariq's soldiers pursued them, cutting them down as they fled. King Roderick disappeared in the chaos of the battle. His horse was found by the river, still wearing its royal trappings. His crown and his royal robes were recovered from the banks. But his body was never found, despite extensive searches in the aftermath of the battle. Perhaps he was killed in the fighting and his corpse was never identified among the heaps of dead. Perhaps he drowned trying to cross the river in his heavy armor. Perhaps, as some later legends would suggest, he survived and fled, living out his days in obscurity, a king without a kingdom, a man whose very existence had become irrelevant. The mystery of Roderick's fate has never been solved, and it probably never will be. What is certain is that after the Battle of Guadalete, he was gone from history, and his kingdom was gone with him. The battle was more than a military defeat. It was the end of the Visigothic kingdom. The army that Roderick had assembled represented the military strength of the Gothic state, and that army had been destroyed. The nobles who had led their retinues to battle were dead or scattered or in flight. There was no second army to gather, no reserve force waiting in the wings, no defensive line that could be held while new forces were assembled. The heartland of the kingdom lay open before Tariq, and he did not hesitate to seize the opportunity. The conquest that had seemed impossible just months before now seemed inevitable. The man who had burned his ships had proven that his confidence was not misplaced. After the battle, Tariq divided his forces and sent them in multiple directions, seeking to conquer as much territory as possible before any organized resistance could form. He himself led the main body of the army north, toward Toledo, the ancient capital of the Visigothic kingdom. The march was swift, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. The cities and towns along the route offered little resistance. Their defenders had been killed at Guadalete, their leaders had fled, and the common people saw no reason to die for a kingdom that had already fallen. Some cities opened their gates willingly, hoping to secure favorable terms from the conquerors. Others were abandoned by their populations, left empty for the invaders to occupy. The speed of the conquest astonished contemporaries and has impressed historians ever since. A kingdom that had stood for nearly 3 centuries was collapsing in a matter of months. Toledo fell without a siege. The great capital, the seat of Visigothic kings for generations, the site of church councils that had shaped the religious life of the kingdom, surrendered to Tariq's army with barely a struggle. The treasures of the Gothic kings, accumulated over centuries of rule, fell into the hands of the conquerors. The churches and palaces of the city, the symbols of Visigothic power and civilization, now belonged to the servants of a different faith. Tariq entered the city as a conqueror, the former slave who had destroyed a kingdom, the man whose gamble had paid off beyond anything he could have imagined. The burning of the ships had been vindicated. The promise of his speech had been fulfilled. God had indeed delivered this land into their hands. But the conquest was not yet complete. Even as Tariq was entering Toledo, resistance continued in other parts of the peninsula. Visigothic nobles who had escaped the disaster at Guadalete were trying to organize defenses in the north, in the mountainous regions where the terrain favored defenders and where the conquerors would have difficulty bringing their full strength to bear. The conquest of the entire peninsula would take years, not months, and Tariq would not be the one to complete it. In the summer of 712, just a year after the initial landing, a new figure arrived on the scene, Musa ibn Nusair himself, crossing the strait with a fresh army, determined to claim his share of the glory. Musa ibn Nusair had watched from across the strait as his subordinate achieved one of the most remarkable conquests in military history. He had sent Tariq on this mission, had provided him with troops and ships and authorization, had made the invasion possible through his planning and preparation. But it was Tariq who had burned the ships, Tariq who had given the famous speech, Tariq who had destroyed the Visigothic army at Guadalete, Tariq who had entered Toledo in triumph. The glory of the conquest was accruing to the freedman, not to the master who had sent him. For a man of Musa's ambition and pride, this was an intolerable situation. He had not spent decades rising through the ranks of the Caliphate's administration, had not conquered all of North Africa, had not planned and organized this invasion, only to see his subordinate claim all the credit. In the summer of 712, Musa crossed the strait himself, at the head of a fresh army perhaps 18,000 strong, determined to take his rightful place at the head of the conquest. The army Musa brought was larger than the force Tariq had originally commanded, and it included a higher proportion of Arabs as opposed to Berbers. This was not accidental. Musa wanted to assert the primacy of Arab leadership over the conquest, to ensure that the credit and the spoils went to the Arab elite rather than to Berber soldiers and their Berber commander. The relationship between Arabs and Berbers in the early Islamic Caliphate was complex and often tense. The Arabs saw themselves as the original Muslims, the people among whom the Prophet had lived and preached, the natural leaders of the Islamic community. The Berbers were newcomers to the faith, recent converts whose commitment and understanding of Islam might be questioned. The fact that a Berber freedman had achieved such spectacular success was gratifying to the Berber soldiers but potentially threatening to the Arab establishment. Musa's arrival with a predominantly Arab army was a statement about who was really in charge of this enterprise. When Musa and Tariq met, presumably somewhere in the conquered territory, the encounter was not entirely friendly. The sources hint at tension between the two men, at accusations and recriminations, at Musa's anger that Tariq had exceeded his mandate and claimed too much glory for himself. Some sources say that Musa struck Tariq, or had him placed in chains, or publicly humiliated him in front of the assembled soldiers. Others suggest that the two men reconciled and cooperated effectively in completing the conquest. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. There was certainly tension, certainly resentment on Musa's part and perhaps on Tariq's as well. But there was also work to be done, a conquest to complete, a peninsula to subdue. Whatever their personal feelings, the two men had to work together, and work together they did. Over the following months and years, the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula proceeded with remarkable speed. Musa and Tariq, operating sometimes together and sometimes in separate columns, swept across the land like a tide. Cities fell one after another, Seville with its ancient Roman heritage, Merida with its magnificent Roman ruins, Zaragoza in the northeast, and countless smaller towns and fortresses. The pattern was consistent. Cities that surrendered without resistance were treated relatively well, their populations allowed to keep their property and practice their religion in exchange for paying taxes and accepting Muslim political authority. Cities that resisted were dealt with harshly, their defenders killed or enslaved, their wealth confiscated, their fate serving as a warning to others. Most cities chose to surrender. The Visigothic kingdom had collapsed so completely that resistance seemed futile. Better to accept the new masters and hope for decent treatment than to fight and risk annihilation. The terms offered to the conquered populations were, by the standards of the time, relatively generous. Christians and Jews were recognized as people of the book, communities whose scriptures were acknowledged by Islam as containing divine revelation, even if that revelation had been superseded by the final message of the Prophet Muhammad. They were allowed to practice their religions, to maintain their churches and synagogues, to follow their own laws in matters of personal status like marriage and inheritance. In exchange, they paid a special tax called the jizya, a head tax imposed on non-Muslims in lieu of military service. They also accepted certain social disabilities, restrictions on building new churches, on public displays of their religion, on their interactions with Muslims. But within these limits, they were left largely alone. For many of the conquered people, especially those who had suffered under the Visigothic regime, this was not such a bad bargain. The jizya was often less burdensome than the taxes they had paid before, and the new rulers seemed less interested in interfering with their daily lives than the Visigoths had been. The Jewish community, in particular, had reason to welcome the change of rulers. After decades of persecution under the Visigothic kings, they found the Muslim conquerors remarkably tolerant. The restrictions that Islam placed on Jews were far less severe than the policies of the Visigothic kingdom, which had attempted to force conversion and had subjected those who refused to convert to increasingly harsh disabilities. Under Muslim rule, Jews could practice their religion openly, could engage in commerce and the professions, could live and work alongside their Muslim and Christian neighbors. Some later traditions, probably exaggerated, claim that the Jews actively assisted the Muslim conquest, opening the gates of cities to the invaders, serving as guides and informants. Whether or not these stories are literally true, they reflect a reality. The Jewish community had little reason to mourn the passing of the Visigothic kingdom and considerable reason to welcome its successors. By 714, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. The conquest had taken only about 3 years, an astonishingly short time to subdue a land of this size and population. Only in the far north, in the mountainous regions of Asturias and the Basque Country, did significant resistance continue. These remote and rugged areas, never fully integrated into the Visigothic kingdom, would become the nucleus of the Christian kingdoms that would eventually reconquer the peninsula. But that reconquest lay centuries in the future. For now, the land that the Arabs called Al-Andalus stretched from the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar, from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. A new chapter in the history of the Iberian Peninsula had begun. And then, at the height of their success, both Musa and Tariq were summoned home. In 714, orders arrived from the Caliph al-Walid I in Damascus, commanding the two commanders to leave the peninsula they had conquered and present themselves at the capital. The reasons for this summons are not entirely clear. Perhaps the Caliph was concerned about the power that Musa was accumulating so far from the center of the empire, worried that a successful general with a devoted army might become a threat to the dynasty. Perhaps he wanted to reward the conquerors in person, to receive his share of the vast treasure they had accumulated. Perhaps there were accusations against Musa or Tariq, charges of misconduct or exceeding their authority, that the Caliph wished to investigate. The sources offer different explanations, and the truth may never be known. What is certain is that both men obeyed the summons. They left the land they had conquered, entrusting its governance to subordinates, and traveled east across North Africa toward the capital of the Caliphate. The journey was long and arduous, thousands of miles across desert and mountain, through provinces that Musa himself had helped to conquer. They brought with them a portion of the treasure they had accumulated, a staggering quantity of gold and silver, jewels and precious objects, intended as gifts for the Caliph and as evidence of what they had achieved. They also brought prisoners, including members of the Visigothic royal family, living proof that a kingdom had fallen. It was a triumphal procession of sorts, but also a journey into uncertainty. They did not know what awaited them in Damascus, whether honor or disgrace, reward or punishment. The Caliph who had summoned them, Al-Walid I, died before they arrived. His successor, Sulayman, was less favorably disposed toward Musa, for reasons that the sources do not entirely explain. Perhaps there were personal animosities, political rivalries, disputes over the division of the spoils. Perhaps Sulayman simply wanted to assert his authority over a powerful subordinate. Whatever the reason, Musa was not rewarded but punished. He was stripped of his wealth, removed from power, and left to live out his days in obscurity and poverty. The man who had conquered all of North Africa and overseen the conquest of Spain died in disgrace, his achievements unrewarded, his final years a misery. And Tariq? The sources are even less clear about what happened to the man who burned his ships. He disappears from the historical record after the journey to Damascus, his final years and his death unrecorded. Some sources say he was also disgraced, caught up in the fall of his patron Musa. Others say he was treated somewhat better, allowed to live in modest comfort if not in honor. A few suggest that he died during the journey east, never reaching Damascus at all. We simply do not know. The man who changed history, whose name is still attached to one of the most famous geographical features in the world, fades from view like smoke dispersing on the wind. He may have died in poverty, forgotten by the empire he had helped to expand. He may have lived for years in obscurity, an old man remembering the days when he had stood on a foreign shore and watched his ships burn. We will never know the truth. The sources fall silent, and Tariq ibn Ziyad passes from history into legend. But what he left behind was more than a conquered territory. The invasion that Tariq led gave birth to one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history, a civilization that would flourish for nearly 800 years and leave an indelible mark on the culture of Europe and the world. The land that the Arabs called Al-Andalus became a center of learning, culture, and sophistication that had few equals in the medieval world. While much of Europe languished in what later centuries would call the Dark Ages, Al-Andalus blazed with light. Its cities were among the largest and most beautiful in the world. Its scholars preserved and transmitted the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. Its poets and musicians created works of art that are still admired today. Its architects built monuments that continue to take the breath away more than 1,000 years after their construction. The city of Córdoba became the jewel of Al-Andalus, the largest and most cultured city in Western Europe. At its height in the 10th century, Córdoba may have had a population of 500,000 people, at a time when Paris and London were small towns of a few thousand souls each. The city had hundreds of mosques, hundreds of public baths, thousands of shops and markets. It had paved streets, street lighting, running water, a level of urban infrastructure that would not be matched elsewhere in Europe for centuries. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of books, an unimaginable treasure of learning in an age when a monastery might consider itself wealthy to possess a few dozen volumes. Scholars came from across the Islamic world and from Christian Europe to study in Córdoba, to learn from its teachers, to copy its manuscripts, to participate in its intellectual life. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, begun in the 8th century and expanded over the following 200 years, became one of the wonders of the Islamic world. Its forest of columns, more than 800 of them supporting double arches of red and white stone, created an effect of infinite space that still amazes visitors today. The mosque was the religious heart of Al-Andalus, the place where the faithful gathered for Friday prayers, the symbol of Muslim power and piety in this westernmost outpost of Islam. When the Christians conquered Córdoba in 1236, they converted the mosque into a cathedral, but they preserved much of its Islamic architecture, recognizing its beauty even as they consecrated it to a different faith. Today, the building is both a church and a monument to the civilization that created it, a testament to what human beings can achieve when cultures meet and mingle and inspire each other. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Al-Andalus was the convivencia, the living together of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in a society that, while certainly not equal, allowed for a degree of interaction and exchange that was rare in the medieval world. This was not tolerance in the modern sense. Muslims were the ruling class, and Christians and Jews were subordinate communities with defined and limited rights. There were periods of persecution and conflict, times when the relative harmony broke down and violence erupted. But at its best, Al-Andalus offered something unusual for its time, a society where people of different faiths could live as neighbors, could do business together, could learn from each other, could create a shared culture that transcended religious boundaries. Jewish civilization flourished in Al-Andalus as it flourished nowhere else in the medieval world. Jewish scholars wrote philosophy and poetry in Arabic, participated in the intellectual life of the Muslim courts, achieved positions of influence and respect. The greatest Jewish philosopher of the medieval period, Maimonides, was a product of Al-Andalus, though he spent much of his life in exile after the coming of the intolerant Almohad dynasty. Jewish poets like Judah Halevi and Solomon ibn Gabirol created works that are still treasured in the Jewish literary tradition. For Jewish communities elsewhere in medieval Europe, suffering under periodic persecutions and constant disabilities, Al-Andalus seemed like a golden land, a place where Jews could live and create and prosper as they could nowhere else. This was the society that grew from the conquest that Tariq began. The intellectual achievements of Al-Andalus had consequences that extended far beyond its borders. It was in Al-Andalus that the works of ancient Greek philosophers, lost to Western Europe after the fall of Rome, were preserved in Arabic translation and eventually passed back into Latin, sparking the intellectual revival that would lead to the Renaissance. Aristotle and Plato, Euclid and Ptolemy, Galen and Hippocrates, these giants of ancient thought survived the centuries of European darkness in Arabic translations made by Muslim scholars, many of them working in Al-Andalus or in the Eastern Islamic lands. When European Christians finally began to recover their classical heritage, they did so largely through translations from Arabic, made in places like Toledo by teams of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars working together. The transmission of classical knowledge through Al-Andalus changed the course of European history, making possible the recovery of ancient learning that would transform medieval Christendom. The physical legacy of Al-Andalus is written in stone and tile, in monuments that still stand after more than 1,000 years. The Great Mosque of Córdoba is the most famous, but it is far from alone. The Alhambra in Granada, the last great achievement of Andalusian art, rises above its city like a dream of paradise made solid. Its courtyards and fountains, its intricate decorations of carved stucco and colored tile, its play of light and shadow and water, speak of a civilization that valued beauty above almost everything else. The Alhambra was built in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after Tariq's time, but it represents the culmination of the artistic tradition that began with the conquest he led. The Giralda in Seville, originally a minaret and now a cathedral bell tower, still dominates the skyline of that city, a reminder of the centuries when Islam ruled this land. The Alcazar of Seville, with its gardens and courtyards, shows the influence of Andalusian design even though much of it was built by Christian rulers after the Reconquest. These buildings are the most visible legacy of the conquest that Tariq began, monuments to what human beings can create when cultures meet and mingle and inspire each other. Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula would last, in one form or another, for nearly 800 years. The unified caliphate that the Umayyads established gave way, in the 11th century, to a patchwork of smaller kingdoms called taifas, each with its own ruler, its own court, its own cultural traditions. These Taifa kingdoms were often more interested in fighting each other than in resisting the Christian kingdoms of the north, which were slowly expanding southward in what they called the Reconquista, the Reconquest. Waves of Berber dynasties from North Africa, first the Almoravids and then the Almohads, crossed the strait to shore up Muslim power in Spain, bringing with them stricter interpretations of Islam that disrupted the relative tolerance of earlier periods. The tide of reconquest ebbed and flowed, with victories and defeats on both sides, with periods of advance and periods of stalemate. But the overall trend was clear. The Christian kingdoms were expanding, the Muslim kingdoms were shrinking, and eventually the end would come. The final Muslim kingdom in Iberia was Granada, in the far south, protected by mountains and by the divisions among its Christian enemies. For more than 2 centuries, Granada survived as an island of Islamic civilization in an increasingly Christian sea. It was during this final period that the Alhambra was built, a monument to the beauty and sophistication of Andalusian culture even as that culture was approaching its end. In 1492, the same year that Columbus set sail for the New World, the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, conquered Granada. The last Muslim ruler, Muhammad XII, known to the Spaniards as Boabdil, surrendered his kingdom and went into exile. According to legend, as he left Granada for the last time, he paused on a mountain pass to look back at the city he had lost, and he wept. His mother, seeing his tears, is said to have told him, "You do well to weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." The pass is still called the Puerto del Suspiro del Moro, the Pass of the Moor's Sigh. And so ended nearly 800 years of Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula. The civilization that Tariq's conquest had created passed into history, its people scattered or converted or expelled, its mosques turned into churches, its books burned or hidden or carried into exile. The Reconquista was followed by the Inquisition, by the persecution of those who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly maintaining their old faith. The Muslims who remained in Spain after 1492, the Moriscos, faced increasing pressure to assimilate, and in 1609 they were expelled entirely, hundreds of thousands of people forced to leave the land that had been their home for centuries. The Jews had already been expelled in 1492, given the choice of conversion or exile, their centuries of flourishing in Al-Andalus ending in dispossession and wandering. The Golden Age was over, and a darker age had taken its place. But the influence of Al-Andalus did not end with the Reconquista. The centuries of Muslim rule had changed Spain in ways that could not be undone by conquest or conversion or expulsion. The Spanish language contains thousands of words borrowed from Arabic, words for foods and architectural features, for scientific concepts and everyday objects. The architecture of Spain shows the influence of Islamic design. In the arches and tiles of buildings constructed long after the Muslims had gone, in the courtyards and fountains of palaces built by Christian kings. The music of Spain, especially the flamenco of Andalusia, bears traces of its Arab and Berber heritage. When Spanish conquistadors sailed across the Atlantic to conquer the New World, they carried with them traditions and assumptions that had been shaped by centuries of contact with Islamic civilization. The influence of Al-Andalus extended far beyond the peninsula, shaping the culture of Latin America and through it the culture of the modern world. And at the center of it all, at the origin of this extraordinary story, stands the figure of Tariq ibn Ziyad, the former slave who burned his ships and conquered a kingdom, the Berber freedman who destroyed an empire that had stood for nearly 3 centuries, the commander who gave a speech that has echoed through the ages, reminding generation after generation of what is possible when retreat is not an option. We do not know where he is buried. We do not know how he spent his final years. We do not know whether he lived to be an old man, looking back on memories of distant shores and burning ships, or whether he died young, his potential unfulfilled, his story cut short by the caprice of caliphs. The silence of the sources is frustrating but also, in a way, appropriate. Tariq's importance lies not in the details of his biography but in what he did and what it meant. He changed history. He founded a civilization. He gave his name to a rock. That is his legacy, and it is more than most human beings ever achieve. There is a question that lingers after all the history has been told, after all the battles and conquests and cultural achievements have been recounted. Was Tariq truly the author of his own fate, the master of his own destiny, or was he merely the instrument of larger forces, carried along by currents he could not control? He was born a slave, his future determined by others. He was sent on this mission by Musa, executing a plan that was not entirely his own. He conquered a kingdom that was already falling apart, taking advantage of divisions and betrayals that he had not created. And he was summoned away at the moment of his triumph, his career ended by orders from a distant capital, his final years shrouded in mystery and probably in obscurity. Was he a great man who shaped history, or was history shaped by forces that merely used him as a tool? The answer, perhaps, is both. Great events are never the work of one person alone. The conquest of Spain required the weakness of the Visigoths, the support of disaffected factions within the kingdom, the resources of the Umayyad Caliphate, the labor of thousands of soldiers whose names are lost to history. Tariq was the commander, but he was not the entire army. He was the leader, but leadership means nothing without followers. His achievement was real, but it was also the product of circumstances that he did not create and could not control. And yet, within those circumstances, he made choices that mattered. He chose to burn the ships. He chose to give the speech. He chose to press forward when he could have consolidated, to attack when he could have waited, to seize opportunities that another commander might have missed. He was not simply carried by the tide of history. He helped to direct that tide, to channel its force toward ends that he had chosen. That is what makes him more than a historical footnote, what makes his story worth telling 13 centuries after his death. The night grows late, and this tale of courage and conquest draws to a close. The ships have long since burned to ash, scattered by winds and waves across the centuries. The battles have faded, the kingdoms have fallen, the civilizations that rose and flourished have passed into history. The man who started it all has been dead for more than 1,000 years, his bones lying in some unmarked grave that no one will ever find. And yet the story remains, passed down through generations, remembered when so much else has been forgotten. The sea is behind you, and the enemy before you. There is no retreat. There is only forward, into whatever waits beyond the horizon, into victory or death, into the unknown. Why does this story still resonate after so many centuries? Perhaps because it touches something fundamental in human nature, something that every person who has ever faced a difficult choice can understand. We all stand at some point in our lives on a shore with the sea behind us and the enemy before us. We all face moments when retreat is tempting, when the safety of the familiar beckons, when the unknown ahead seems too frightening to confront. And we all must choose, in those moments, whether to go forward or to go back, whether to risk everything on the chance of victory or to accept a smaller life in exchange for safety. Tariq's story reminds us that sometimes the only way to achieve great things is to make retreat impossible, to burn the ships, to commit absolutely to the path we have chosen. It is not advice that applies to every situation. Sometimes retreat is the wise choice, sometimes safety is the better option, sometimes the ships should be preserved for another day. But there are moments when half measures will not suffice, when partial commitment guarantees failure, when the only way through is forward with everything we have. In those moments, Tariq's story speaks to us across the centuries, reminding us of what is possible when human beings commit themselves absolutely to a goal. The Strait of Gibraltar still separates two continents, as it did when Tariq crossed it more than 1,300 years ago. Ships still pass through its narrow waters, carrying goods and passengers between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, between Africa and Europe. Airplanes fly overhead, their passengers looking down at the blue water and the rocky shores, most of them unaware of the history that was made here. The Great Rock still rises from the sea, topped now by British fortifications and Barbary macaques, a tourist destination and a strategic position and a symbol of colonial legacy. But beneath all the layers of subsequent history, beneath the British flag and the tourist shops and the border disputes with Spain, the rock retains its oldest name, Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq, the name of a Berber slave who burned his ships and changed the world. Rest now, and let the story settle into your mind like sand settling through still water. Dream of distant shores and difficult choices, of courage in the face of impossible odds, of the power that lies in having nothing left to lose. Dream of ships burning on a foreign beach, of smoke rising against a foreign sky, of soldiers watching their only way home consumed by flames. Dream of the speech that was given, or that legend gave, the words that have echoed through the centuries and will echo through centuries more. The sea is behind you, and the enemy before you. There is no retreat. There is only forward. And in the quiet of the night, as ships still pass through the strait beneath his mountain, the story of Tariq ibn Ziyad whispers to all who will listen that sometimes the only way forward is to make going back impossible, to burn the ships, to commit absolutely to the unknown. Rest now and remember. Rest now and dream. The past keeps its secrets, and the morning will come, as it always does, carrying with it the promise of new shores, new choices, new opportunities to be seized by those who are brave enough to burn their ships.